Have you ever wondered that our brightest victories were forged in the dirtiest shit? Hello, my name is Robert. I'm telling you, forget the pretentious films about World War II. This story is not about parades and clean tunics. This is a story about how the United States military fleet made a secret deal with the head of the most ruthless criminal empire in New York to defeat Hitler. We're talking about Operation Underworld and Lucky Luciano. This guy was in prison for 30 years, but his hands controlled everything: ports, smuggling, elections. And then those same hands touched the plan for the invasion of Sicily. We gave him freedom, and he gave us victory. And here is the truth for you, friend. To save the world, sometimes you have to sell your soul. You're watching this video. You're 45, you're 55, and you think you know this war, but you are wrong. Sit down comfortably, lie under a blanket, or whatever you like. Friend, I only need your subscription and to your hands. Press the cherished button. And now, to the point. Understand one thing. When the war began, the battle was not only on European fields. It came to us right here, to our shores. By the beginning of '42, the Atlantic had become a bloody meat grinder, and we were losing. We were losing, sitting in our offices on Wall Street. 120 merchant ships. 120 ships simply disappeared in the first 3 months after Pearl Harbor, crushed by German submarines. Not somewhere far away, but right here, off Long Island, off New Jersey. German captains saw the light of the Statue of Liberty when they sank our convoys with ammunition, medical supplies, fuel. They operated in our waters, like in their own swimming pool, and damn it, someone was helping them. The Port of New York, this was our supply throat. Everything for Lend-Lease went through it, everything for our future invasions. But this port was sick. It was infected, like gangrene. On February 9th, '42, it happened. You probably remember the liner Normandy, the pride of France, a giant ship, almost 1,030 feet long. We took it, renamed it Lafayette, and began to convert it into a military transport, a ship that was supposed to transport an entire division of soldiers. And now it is burning. It is simply ablaze right off Pier 88 in Manhattan. In the end, the Normandy capsized, sank, and everyone saw this national humiliation. The authorities, of course, said it was an accident, a spark from a welding machine. But who are you telling? People saw smoke over the Hudson. They heard that just a month before, 33 German spies had been arrested in Brooklyn. It is impossible to believe in such an accident. Rumors of sabotage and Nazi agents on the piers instantly spread. We understood that the New York waterfront, our main life nerve, was not controlled by our Navy or the police. It was controlled by those who wear dockers' caps, who hide knives under their jackets, who command cargo cranes and the market. Naval Intelligence, the Office of Naval Intelligence, was supposed to protect this port. They were the elite. And they failed. They didn't need the police. They needed a force that would operate by the same dirty rules as the saboteurs. They understood that a deal had to be made with the devil. And that devil was already waiting. They went where the law had no weight. They went to the people who controlled every square inch of the piers, from fishing schooners to dock workers' unions. These people had no conscience, but they had power. What power? That is what we will talk about next. About why our intelligence was forced to ask for help from the most untouchable, the richest, and the most influential rat who could possibly be sitting in prison. You know what the problem with the law is? It's straightforward. It says, first, prove it, then jail them. In war, there is no time to prove. You need to act. And on the New York piers, the law hadn't worked for 30 years. It was a world of union bosses who were far more dangerous than any mayor or sheriff. Stevedores, dock workers, tugboat captains. This whole machine that provided life for the city and the army was saturated, like a sponge, with the Mafia. Any box of cartridges, Any barrel of fuel that went onto a ship passed by their eyes and under their control. How did it work? The scheme is simple. You own the union. You decide who works today. You set the rates. You decide who sits behind the wheel of the crane that will lift your military cargo. And what's important, the Mafia controlled not just the dock workers. They controlled all the information on the pier. They knew the schedule. They knew the cargo. After the Normandy disaster, naval intelligence, those guys from the ONI, were in a panic. They were told from above, the port must be safe, at any cost. But whom could they send there? Their clean-booted Marines. They would be immediately tossed into the water along with a bag of stones, their agents with fake mustaches. They would be spotted in half an hour. Intelligence very quickly realized a shocking truth. They cannot protect the port without cooperating with those who control the port. They needed people who could say, "We're taking this guy out. He's a German agent." And this had to happen quickly, without trial and investigation, without the bureaucratic paperwork that our officials love so much. And then this brilliantly cynical plan arose. If you can't beat the enemy on the piers, just join forces with someone who belongs there. Not the police, not the FBI, who would spend years building a case, but the real bosses, real professionals capable of instantly extinguishing a strike, removing an unnecessary worker, and stopping any rumor about the movement of ships. In the end, they found the only organization in the city whose power on the piers was total: the Italian-American Mafia. It was a desperate measure, and they went to the head of the criminal underworld. They went to the man who could solve the problem of Nazi sabotage, sitting in his cell. We will talk about him, about Lucky Luciano, who seemed to be a finished man, but whom the war brought back into the game. And it was the wildest comeback in the history of the criminal world. His name is Charlie Luciano, but everyone knows him as Lucky, the lucky one. Damn, he didn't need luck. He had intelligence and a brutal grip. This is a guy who didn't just come to America from Sicily to steal oranges. He was essentially the founder of modern organized crime in the States. Before him, the Mafia was old-fashioned, those respected men in long coats, sitting in their basements. Luciano crushed them. He saw crime as a corporation, as the five families, these five pillars that held New York, and through it, all of America. He made criminals speak the language of business, not just blood revenge. He was the boss of bosses, the true CEO of the American Mafia. But by 42, Lucky Luciano was only a memory, a ghost locked in a cell. He was sitting in a maximum security prison in Great Meadow. He was sent there by a prosecutor who would later become known as a fighter against evil, Thomas Dewey. A harsh sentence, 30 to 50 years. What did Lucky control from behind bars? The cell did not cut off his power. Understand, the Mafia is a vertical structure. It works even if the boss leaves. All his deputies, the street bosses, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, continued to carry out his instructions. Through lawyers, through relatives, through the old telephone line from the world behind the wall, he continued to pull the strings. And the most important string was, of course, the New York docks and unions. This was his foundation. If you needed to quickly organize smuggling, if you needed to know where a cargo transport was going, everyone knew who to go to. No one could get a job on the pier without a nod from Luciano's people. Everything rested on this, on fear, on loyalty, and on fast money. When the burning liner Normandy settled to the bottom of the Hudson, the whole country was in shock, but not the Mafia. This was their territory. And naval intelligence knew that Luciano was the only man capable of giving them the green light in this dirty working-class district. Without his order, his men simply wouldn't talk to the feds. They would just laugh in their faces. Therefore, the intelligence officers faced an unthinkable task: how to go to the country's biggest criminal and say to him, "Charlie, help us save America." The answer to this question lay in a subtle game of blackmail, patriotism, and, of course, personal interest. And this resulted in what will forever remain in history under the brutal name, Operation Underworld. You know, the word Underworld sounds like the title of a pulp novel, but it was an official code term. The Office of Naval Intelligence, or ONI, named its operation of cooperation with the Mafia Underworld. This already says a lot. No rose-tinted glasses. It was an admission. We are working with the Underworld. The secret deal began with two key people, one of whom was a man who could speak on behalf of the Navy. He had to have the courage to go behind bars and ask for help. The second man who built the bridge to Luciano was Frank Costello, the one who was called the Prime Minister of the Mafia. He was the brains and political force of the family, did not like dirt, preferred expensive suits and phone calls. The intelligence representative went to the prison. Can you imagine the scene? A senior Navy officer sitting opposite a man sentenced to 50 years and negotiating. At stake is the salvation of American ports from Nazi sabotage. What did Luciano say? This, of course, is not a transcript for the press, but I think he listened silently, with a sarcastic smile. In his eyes was written, "You came to me, feds. You put me in. And now you're asking me for help?" And Lucky's answer was pragmatic. He was not a patriot in the sense that they understand at parades. But he was a Sicilian, and he had a business. The Nazis and their spies were a threat to this business. They were sinking ships that carried his contraband. They were interfering with his control over the unions. He didn't like Hitler. He despised him because he was a destroyer of the order established by him. The terms of the deal, those secret inks, were simple and brutal. The Mafia ensures 100% security of the ports of New York and New Orleans. No sabotage, no spies. They had to create absolute silence. In return, Lucky Luciano was promised that his case would be reviewed after the war. That was the price of his freedom. To ensure this silence, Luciano was reportedly given a special privilege. He was transferred to a more comfortable prison in Assembly, where the guards suddenly became more loyal to him. Now he could work, and the Mafia did its job, like the flick of a switch. Luciano's men instantly identified dozens of suspicious dock workers. Some accidentally disappeared. Others simply stopped coming to work. The ports were cleared. The Navy received information about smuggling schemes and cargo movements, which they couldn't achieve for years. Luciano became a shadow counterintelligence agent. Very soon, this deal from New York grew into something more, into a plan that influenced the landing of our troops in Sicily. Luciano, sitting in prison, was ready to provide intelligence not only about the ports. He knew all of Sicily. He knew what it meant to talk to local dons. And this was the next, much more dangerous and cynical stage of the deal, about how our enemy inside the country became our main ally in the Mediterranean. The deal I spoke about was not just a truce. It was a marriage of convenience, where each side held a stone up their sleeve. American intelligence gained control over the ports. Luciano gained hope for freedom and leverage. But this marriage was supposed to produce a child, victory in Sicily. Now imagine the situation. The end of 42. America and the Allies are planning Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, the landing. This was critically important because it was the first step in the European theater that was supposed to knock Italy out of the war. But there was a problem. Sicily was like an enchanted island. We had neither an accurate map nor sufficient intelligence about the coastline. The Germans and fascists occupied the island, and they had their eyes there. People were needed on the ground. People who could give information, show safe routes for our troops, disorganize resistance. Locals were needed. And who was in charge in Sicily? The Don. And everyone knew that Lucky Luciano was from there. This is where his personal interest and the interests of the war converge. Luciano hated Mussolini. Believe me, It was a personal vendetta. Mussolini, being a fascist dictator, publicly declared war on the Sicilian Mafia. He called them parasites on the body of Italy. He launched ruthless roundups, arresting thousands. He believed that the Mafia was an insult to his new great Roman Empire. Thus, Luciano's enemy, Mussolini, became America's enemy. And Luciano saw his golden opportunity here. This was not a love for the flag with stars and stripes. It was a thirst for revenge, and also, it was business. The American victory meant that the old reliable Mafia families, who were his friends and relatives, would regain the power taken from them by the fascists. The key link, the man who threw the information and the plan to the other side, was Meyer Lansky. Lansky. If Lucky was the king of the underworld, Lansky was his treasurer, his gray eminence, his genius. And he was Jewish. Imagine, this quiet, very smart man, whose compatriots were dying in Europe, became the mediator between American intelligence and the Sicilian Dons. His connection with Luciano was stronger than steel. It was Lansky who negotiated the details, the signals, and the contacts that would be used during the invasion. Intelligence needed radio transmitters, weapons, and money to send to the partisans in Sicily. Luciano, through Lansky, gave not just names, he gave structures, families, the system. Understand, when you land on foreign soil, the most terrible enemy is ignorance, and the Mafia was selling knowledge. It was a deal that changed the course of the war in the Mediterranean. We paid with Luciano's freedom. They paid with their power over Sicily. And one of the architects of this deal was a man who, essentially, laid the foundation for the modern Mafia, a Jew who saw Hitler as a personal enemy. And we'll talk about this man, Meyer Lansky, who acted quietly, like a shadow, right now. When people hear Mafia, they imagine loud shouts, heavy gold chains, and shootouts in a bar. Luciano, Genovese, these were leaders of action. But Meyer Lansky is a completely different animal. He was, if you will, a financial analyst, a strategist, the accountant of the Mafia. That's why I called him the Albert Einstein of the ports. Quiet, modest, always in a perfectly fitted suit, he knew how to make numbers dirty and clean at the same time. Lansky was not Italian. He was a Polish Jew who in his early youth befriended Luciano and Benjamin Siegel, the famous Bugsy. Their national crime syndicate was the first step toward total centralization. They worked without ethnic borders, simply as the most effective criminal conglomerate. Why was Lansky so important in Operation Underworld? Because he was pure pragmatism. He did not have that Sicilian code of honor, the omerta, which sometimes hindered things. He saw the war as risk management. Firstly, anti-fascism. He did not tolerate Hitler, and it was personal for him. His motives were simpler and more powerful than anyone else's. It was the desire to stop the one who was killing his people. He hated Mussolini, who, as I said, persecuted his Italian partners. For him, the war was a personal vendetta. Secondly, logistics. Lucky Luciano, sitting behind bars, could not conduct personal negotiations. Lansky could. He moved freely. He was known as a legitimate businessman. He was able to sit with ONI officers and translate the dry military requirements of intelligence into a language understandable to mafiosi and the dons of Sicily. He became a key operator in this deal. It was Lansky who negotiated how the encrypted messages would be transmitted from American prisons to Sicily. It was he who organized the transport of money that went towards bribes and weapons. We were not just sending requests. We were sending code words, encrypted names of Luciano's old Sicilian contacts, and his role on the New York piers. Lansky held the threads of the port unions. It was he who ensured the silence that the Navy ordered. He simply told his people, anything that looks like Nazi sabotage, it's finished. And it was done without a single shot from the military. Imagine the cynicism of the situation. A man who built gambling empires and controlled traffic in the States was now helping our elite special services planned the largest invasion in the Mediterranean. This fact hits you right in the brain. Lansky, with his phenomenal memory, with his capacity for logistics, was priceless. It was proof that war is not done by the hands of clean people, and that our great victories did not always have moral superiority. The military used a man we considered evil, and soon we needed to check how this dirty deal works in the field, far from Manhattan. We needed confirmation that their people on the streets were not just talkers. And it didn't take long. We will talk about how the Mafia saved one ship from sinking and thereby earned the trust of the intelligence. As they say in my circle, trust but verify. And when you trust a convict who is the king of the Mafia, you must verify with double force. After the start of Operation Underworld, the ONI officers perfectly understood that they were working with a wolf. Lucky Luciano, through Lansky and Costello, transmitted, "My people guarantee silence." But for the Navy, this was not enough. They had to be sure that the Mafia was capable of identifying real threats, and not just scaring dock workers who were sleeping on the job. They needed a test, and this test came from the water. In early '43, a large transport ship stood off the coast of Brooklyn. According to the documents, it was supposed to depart in a week with vital cargo, secret military cargo. The information received from Luciano's people on the piers was like a cold shower. Sabotage was being prepared on the ship, somewhere in the fuel tanks. More precisely, mines were being prepared, which were supposed to be activated in the ocean to sink the vessel unnoticed, far from the shores. Mafia agents named a specific person, a dock worker who had been recruited by the Germans, or was simply pro-Nazi, and indicated where he was supposed to receive the explosives. The intelligence officers were obliged to act extremely covertly, so as not to betray the source of the information, or the fact that they were operating in the port at all. They had to quietly, without any noise, like shadows, penetrate the ship and sweep it at the indicated points. And you know what? They found it. Small, cleverly disguised devices, ready for installation. Something that could sink an entire ship with strategic cargo and ultimately lose hundreds of lives. The Mafia didn't just report. They pointed to the location. They gave precise details that saved the vessel from sinking. For the Navy, this was a moment of truth. Luciano was a legitimate source of information. It was the rat test, and the rat passed it. The rescue of this ship in Brooklyn, whose name still remains shrouded in mystery, became a turning point. After this incident, the highest military command had no doubts left. The Mafia is not just a threat. At the right moment, it can be the most effective tool. We had our hands and eyes at the very bottom, in the working class of the ports, where we, the officers, would never have been able to gain a foothold. This was the final signal. It was time to move on to the next step. The ports were under control. Now the main goal had to be realized, and that goal was Sicily. Luciano proved his usefulness for the defense of our homeland. Now he had to prove his usefulness for the liberation of his own. His freedom depended on it. How they were going to organize an underground network of support in Sicily while being in New York is the highest level of criminal logistics. We will talk further about how the American military collected dossiers on Italian mafiosi for the invasion. So, the check is passed. Trust, or rather cynical confidence in efficiency, between the ONI and the Mafia was established. Now it was time to look across the ocean. The silhouette of Sicily loomed on the horizon, and we needed a perfect landing. Sicily, for the American military, was a complete blank spot. It was an island permeated with traditions, blood ties, and, most importantly, power that wasn't written in the Constitution. Our statutes didn't work there. The laws of Cosa Nostra worked there. The ready invasion plan, Operation Husky, needed local support. And this was not the support of communist partisans, whom Mussolini had long suppressed. It was the support of influential families. Families who had money, connections, warehouses, transport, and, most importantly, unquestionable authority among the local population. Intelligence officers involved Luciano fully. He was transferred from a maximum security prison to something like an operational center in the mountains, where ONI agents could visit him. He became not just a prisoner, he became a consultant on Sicily. What did Luciano provide? He gave names. He literally dictated the names of his friends, his relatives, old associates in Sicily. Understand, the Mafia is not just bandits. It's a network covering all life on the island. Traders, mayors, farmers, truck drivers. These people, humiliated and persecuted by the fascists, longed for the Americans as liberators, and they trusted Luciano. Based on this data, Navy agents created dossiers that looked more like family trees than intelligence. This one, the mayor of a coastal city, he is loyal to Don Vizzini. This one, the head of an agricultural cooperative, he knows all the trails through the mountains. Here he has a weapons depot that Mussolini didn't manage to confiscate. This was gold. In the invasion plans, these people, Mafia bosses and their relatives, were supposed to become the fifth column. Their task was simple. At the moment of the landing, sow chaos in the rear of the Italian and German armies. Destroy communication lines, mess up road signs, sabotage fuel and food depots, and most importantly, convince the local population. Americans are friends. They bring freedom. The Mafia was perfect. It had all the infrastructure that fascism could not destroy. Couriers who could cross front lines, knowledge of all the secret trails, and total control over the rural areas. The image of American friends was much more important for them. It guaranteed them the return of power after we left. The finished plan was monstrously simple. Luciano, through Meyer Lansky, sent coded messages that were delivered to Sicily through old channels, through these cousins. But what were these cousins? These weren't just nice relatives with an olive plantation. These were people who had ruled the island with an iron fist for decades. And in the next chapter, we will see who exactly received our signal and how the American army entered Sicily with mafiosi in the role of guides. It was a game in which there were no good guys. We called it the Ready Plan. And for Lucky Luciano, it was a plan of revenge and resurrection. The cousins on the island, that was a euphemism. The true nature of these brothers can only be understood by realizing how Mussolini tried to tear Sicily out of the clutches of the Mafia. The fascists understood. As long as there is a Mafia, there is no sole authority in Italy. The Mafia was a parallel state. Mussolini sent not just a prosecutor to Sicily, he sent Cesare Mori, a prefect who acted with previously unseen cruelty. Mori was not interested in evidence. He simply needed to get rid of the Dons. He arrested by the hundreds, publicly humiliated mafiosi. In the end, the Sicilian Mafia found itself in exile or behind bars. But the roots, you must understand this, the roots remained. Sicilians remembered who their protector really was. Not an official in Rome, but their local Don, who, although he took money for protection, did it fairly. When Lucky Luciano sent the signal from his prison about his readiness to help, this signal was received by his old associates, people who hated the fascists as much as Luciano did. Their revenge was cold and calculated, and for them, the American invasion was a gift from heaven. One of the key cousins was Don Calogero Vizzini. You will hear his name again. He was an icon, a living legend of Sicily, an old, tough Don. He was a kind of national conscience for many Sicilians, and for the fascists, enemy number one. He was under constant surveillance, his business destroyed, but his word was still law in the rural areas. When Lansky, through intermediaries, passed the cipher, help them. This is our revenge. This is our chance. The Dons immediately got to work. These were not sworn soldiers. These were people who had managed illegal networks for decades. They knew how to organize communication without wires, how to hide weapons. They knew where to look for gasoline that the Germans had not managed to take away. They were preparing to become our guides, our eyes and ears at the moment of the landing. They began to prepare secret hideouts, rework old maps, create lists of loyal people in key ports, such as Palermo and Catania. Now our plan included something that won't be written in history books: hundreds of armed mafiosi working under the guidance of American military intelligence. They were not just waiting. They were ready to strike from the rear, which would be far more terrifying for the Italian army than direct fire from landing craft. For Luciano and his brothers, this was a chance to regain the status quo, to prove that their power could not be broken. For American soldiers, it was the cheapest, fastest, and dirtiest way to conquer the most difficult territory in the world. We will talk about their hatred of the fascists, which drove them to such an alliance, in detail later. About how Mussolini created the most powerful fifth column for the invasion of his own country with his own hands. Understand one simple thing. The Dons, these respected men in Sicily, were not driven by high American patriotism. They were driven, as I already said, by personal revenge. And revenge, unlike patriotism, does not age. This was the most personal conflict there could be. Fascism and the Mafia could not coexist. And here's why. The Mafia lived by its own rules, the omerta and loyalty, and they did not tolerate any competition. Fascism, as a totalitarian ideology, demanded that there be only one law, the law of the Duce, and loyalty must be only to the state. Two such systems in one place would simply tear each other apart. Mussolini chose war against the Mafia, and he began it as a war of extermination. In 25, when Mori arrived in Sicily, he uttered the famous phrase, "Mori, you have all power at your disposal. I am ready to sacrifice even my own life." Mori took this literally. He began to act like an executioner. His men besieged villages. They cut off water and electricity until the dawn came out of hiding. Women who tried to pass food to the prisoners were arrested. This was a brutal tactic that worked. Thousands of mafiosi were jailed. Many were executed without trial. Families were torn apart. Property confiscated. The Mafia ties that had held power for 100 years were physically severed. It was this experience, this humiliation and exile, that became the fuel for our alliance with the Mafia. We, the Yankees, were not just soldiers. We were a machine for vengeance for them. We were a tool that allowed them, the exiled Dons, to reclaim what they had lost. The Don had no doubts about who to cooperate with. When American ships appeared on the horizon, it was a signal that their suffering was over. They knew that Mussolini would not forgive them. And the Americans? Americans, like any smart conqueror, will make a deal if it speeds up the victory. They could negotiate. They were pragmatic. The fascists created their own gravediggers with their own hands. They thought they had killed the snake, but only cut off its head, and the body remained. And now this snake was ready to strike. Cooperation with the Mafia gave us the opportunity to wage this war in the most effective and unexpected way. The military could save thousands of lives because someone inside the island was ready to point out where German roadblocks were located, where to blow up railway tracks to prevent the Germans from moving reinforcements. This was an invisible war before the real one began. Luciano in his prison felt his increased value. His people in Sicily, these cousins, now officially became allies of the United States government. And soon the most exciting part of the operation will begin, the transmission of these signals, the very ones that will command the start of chaos. How could a prisoner transmit precise invasion instructions thousands of miles away? This is a story about how one personal note from prison can change the course of a world war, and about how it was transmitted. The deal that held the lives of thousands of our soldiers on a thread could not rely on a simple telephone line. We needed a guaranteed, absolutely secret system for transmitting data from the king of the Mafia, sitting in prison, to his old friends in enemy territory. Luciano was a secret agent. The special services essentially gave him this status. But he worked not with a microphone in his boot, but with the human factor. The communication system was two-stage, brilliantly simple, and uncontrolled by fascist counterintelligence. Stage 1. Prison, street. The key link here was his old friend and liaison, Meyer Lansky. Luciano's lawyers, under the pretext of discussing an appeal, regularly visited him in a Semla. In these long conversations, full of legal terms, instructions, names, code phrases, and plans were contained. Nothing was written down. Everything was kept in mind. The lawyers were verified Mafia people who knew perfectly well what omerta meant. After the visit, the lawyers met with Lansky, or one of the street bosses, Frank Costello. There, in safe places, in restaurants or expensive clubs, Luciano's instructions were converted into commercial code. Something like, "We need 150 crates of Sicilian oranges by the 7th. Hidden in this message was the route, the exact date of the landing, and the name of the main recipient. Stage 2. Street, Sicily. How to send commercial code through a war zone. Through smugglers and sailors who continued to work despite the war. The Mafia always kept these routes. They used old, proven channels that the Germans and Italians did not control. Fishing schooners that went into international waters, neutral ships, or, most importantly, old port workers who had relatives in Sicily. These couriers knew the code words that allowed them to contact the right person. For example, an old sailor would come to a Sicilian don, such as Vizzini, and say, "Your cousin Charlie asked to say hello. He says he is very tired of bad news and the olive harvest season will begin soon." This was enough for the don to understand. "Our American friends will arrive in so many days. Start preparing the reception." The most important signal was transmitted right before the invasion. Legend has it that an American patrol plane, flying over the landing zone, dropped a small flag, or a piece of cloth with a large, bright letter L, onto a field controlled by Don Vizzini. L for Luciano. This was a direct, undeniable signal for the start of the operation. For the mafiosi, it was like the king's seal. The time had come. The Mafia, persecuted by Mussolini, suddenly began to receive weapons, ammunition, and radio receivers, secretly delivered to them through our naval intelligence. Why did we do this? Because we wanted our soldiers to follow a clear path. We will talk about how this invisible army of mafiosi became our main support on the front line. It was the most surreal invasion in history. On July 10th, 43, Operation Husky began. Sicily. Thousands of our boys, our fathers, were landing on unfamiliar beaches, ready for the toughest fight. But what happened next shocked not only the Germans, but also some of our generals. Our tanks were not driving blindly. They were met by locals, men in worn hats and dark jackets who knew every trail in the mountains like the back of their hand. We called them taxi drivers on the front line. The Mafia people, our cousins, worked perfectly, like a clock driven by revenge. As soon as we stepped ashore, the mafiosi raised an armed uprising in the rear. They did not wear military uniforms. They wore the uniforms of local residents, and this was their main weapon. Their work was multitasking. First, disorientation and sabotage. While the Germans tried to focus on the landing from the sea, Luciano's men attacked the supply lines. Telephone wires cut, railway tracks blown up, road signs at crucial intersections moved. Imagine how this paralyzes enemy logistics. The Germans and Italians, trying to move reinforcements, drove not towards the front, but deep into the mountains, into dead ends. Second, information flow. The most valuable thing we received. The American command received precise data on the location of fascist and German units faster than the Germans managed to report it to headquarters. Mafia liaisons transmitted maps, plans, numbers of soldiers, and artillery. This allowed our troops to bypass the most fortified points. Third, morale and logistics. Italian soldiers were demoralized and did not want to die for Mussolini. The Mafia, which had enormous authority, urged locals not to resist, but if possible, to help the Americans. Warehouses with fuel and food instantly appeared, miraculously found thanks to Luciano's people. Truck drivers who worked for the Mafia became our first logistics centers. The most telling episode occurred in the town of Villalba, associated with Don Calogero Vizzini. Legend has it that he personally, on the day of the landing, drove a car with an American star on the door, accompanied by an American lieutenant. Vizzini personally gave instructions to his men. "This guy is ours. Help him." The Don briefly became the mayor of Villalba, and this was a complete restoration of his power, granted to him by the Americans. The result? An invasion that could have dragged on for months and cost us tens of thousands of lives was completed in 38 days. We swept through Sicily with incredible speed. It was in Sicily that this devilish exchange was made. We got victory. The Mafia got the power that Mussolini had taken from them. And the most important person who understood this was Don Calogero. He took this new power into his hands, and he was not going to give it up. We will talk about this in the next chapter, how the most famous Don received the American seal of official liberator. If you are looking for a symbol of how cynically we waged war, here it is, Don Calogero Vizzini. He was, essentially, the most influential mafioso in Sicily, and our army made a hero liberator out of him. Vizzini, a man who was over 70 at the time. He was a living legend. For several decades he ruled western Sicily, and his constant attribute, a large bright yellow silk scarf that he wore around his neck. They say that when this yellow scarf appeared in the city, people understood. There is power. After the landing, when our troops began to advance inland, they needed translators, guides, and administrators who could govern the cities left without a fascist administration. The American Military Command for Sicily, known as Allied Military Government of Occupied Territories, made a historic mistake that was directly related to Lucky Luciano. They decided that to restore order, they needed those who had authority. And who had the greatest authority in Sicily, besides the church? Of course, the Don. Don Calogero, who was arrested by Mori and hated fascism, suddenly turned into a key ally. He didn't need much. He just needed to regain his position. The Americans, on the other hand, saw him as a fighter for democracy, persecuted by fascist tyranny. This was an incredible propaganda, and as time showed, a suicidal mistake for the island. The apotheosis of cynicism. American officers appointed Vizzini the mayor of his hometown, Villalba. This act, essentially, was the official endorsement of Mafia rule. The Navy signaled the entire island. "We are allies of Don Calogero." His photograph with American military personnel on a jeep, where he is smiling, became the most terrible sign for Sicilians. It meant that the Mafia had not just returned, it had returned with the seal of approval from the American liberators. Vizzini used this to the fullest. As mayor, he immediately began to appoint his people, verified members of Cosa Nostra, to all key positions: police officers, officials, controllers. He gained access to documents and lists confiscated by the fascists, which he used for revenge on his enemies. He received a license to power that he could not have regained otherwise. The result? When we landed, the Mafia was exiled and weak. When we left, it was stronger than ever, thanks to the American army. We came to liberate the island from Mussolini, but in reality, we liberated the Mafia from the fascists and handed them the reins of power, which they haven't let go of since. The Don with the yellow scarf symbolized the victory, not of American democracy, but of old Sicilian power, based on fear and control. This was the bitterest price of our victory. And now we need to talk about it in more detail. We won in Sicily. We took the island and forced Mussolini to fall. Our triumph was fast and brilliant, but for every victory, someone pays. And in this game, the Mafia received an incredible sum. This was the price of liberation. It wasn't in dollars, but in power, and what's scarier, in legitimacy. Look, in just 38 days, the Mafia, exiled to the mountains and prisons, was returned to the chairs of mayors and police chiefs. AMGOT, our American military government, acted under pressure of time, using the logic of efficiency. They wanted order, and in their understanding, order could only be provided by strong men, local authorities, that is, the Dons. Thus the Allies, who fought for freedom, literally laid the foundation for the revival of Cosa Nostra. When Vizzini and his men took official posts, they received, first, a clean reputation. They ceased to be bandits and became resistance fighters, victims of fascism, people whom the Americans approved. This new legend covered all their future crimes. Second, infrastructure. They gained access to state warehouses, transport, police stations. Everything needed to establish the old criminal schemes came under their control. Third, new schemes. Most importantly, American aid. The island needed food, construction materials, and where there is a flow of goods, there is Mafia control. Humanitarian aid and reconstruction loans, which we Americans gave to Sicily, became the perfect tool for the Mafia to launder money and expand influence. They controlled the black markets that grew like mushrooms after the war. After the end of the war in Italy, Cosa Nostra was so strong that it began to engage in politics. They began to control the votes of voters, guaranteeing victory to the parties that were loyal to them. As a result, what began as a secret operation to save American ports led to the emergence of a Mafia government in Sicily. Lucky Luciano, the king of this entire scheme, of course, did not stand aside. As soon as the war ended, his debt was paid. The governor of New York, the very Thomas Dewey who had jailed him, unexpectedly commuted his sentence. In 46, Luciano was released on one condition: deportation to Italy. He left. But it was not exile. It was a triumphant departure. Luciano, deported to Italy, immediately took up his business. He used his new connections and restored control over the international drug traffic that went from Europe to the States. The price of liberation was monstrous. We, the Americans, saved thousands of soldiers' lives in Europe and won a critically important stage of the war. But to do this, we resurrected a beast that soon began to control not only Sicily, but also transatlantic crime. Now we need to look this fact directly in the eyes and understand what trail this dirty deal left in our history, about how, despite the victory, we are responsible for the unleashed genie. We often talk about World War II as a clean conflict between good and evil. It's convenient. It raises spirits. But behind the scenes of this great victory, another dirtier drama unfolded, and its main character was Lucky Luciano, whom I call the unleashed genie. Our military success in Sicily is not disputed. We did our job. We struck Hitler from the rear. But we must understand what we, America, paid. We paid with the revival of international organized crime. Firstly, we legalized the Mafia in Sicily. This is the biggest price. Thanks to our approval, under the guise of liberation, the Mafia gained key posts. Vizzini, who was over 70, immediately used his power to restore the old structures, using American authority as a shield. We thought we were leaving, but we left a time bomb there. Secondly, we brought Lucky Luciano back into the game. His deportation to Italy was not a punishment. It was the highest form of reward. From sunny Naples, Luciano, using his old undestroyed connections in the USA, began to build a new transnational criminal empire. Imagine, when he was in prison, he was isolated. When he was deported, he became the connecting link. His network now stretched from Sicily to New York, from Marseille to Havana. Luciano, this lucky one, used his liberation to organize a new, largest drug traffic, heroin. His liberation became the catalyst. He began to actively build his empire, and his associates in Sicily, those whom we installed to govern, helped him. They controlled the ports, and the ports controlled the smuggling. This cycle closed. The irony of fate. Dewey, the prosecutor who jailed Luciano, became governor and released him under pressure from the War Department. He saved the nation from sabotage, but he returned the nation to criminal chaos that lasted for decades. Luciano proved a simple and cynical truth. There is nothing more powerful than a government contract, even if it is unwritten. We, the military command, gave him an indulgence. We told him and his people, "In the fight against the ultimate evil, we are ready to use your evil. We need you." The price of liberation. It is not only the revival of Cosa Nostra, it is also the cynical precedent we created, that the American government is willing to make deals with the most hardened criminals if it serves its goals. This was the unleashed genie. And you remember that after you unleash the genie, it's almost impossible to shove him back into the lamp. That's why we have to talk about the black page of history. I will not talk about how good it is that we defeated Hitler. We know that. I'm talking about the moral burden that remained on the hands of our nation. On this black page of history, where the stamp Operation Underworld stands, there are two things we must admit. First, the erosion of morality. We Americans have always seen ourselves as those who bring freedom and justice. But in '42, we intentionally conspired with organized crime. We made a secret contract with people who daily murdered, robbed, and terrorized our citizens. We legalized their power in the name of tactical victory. It was a necessary but destructive choice. We stopped being immaculate heroes and became pragmatic players who use any dirty weapon to win. This undermined faith in the purity of our military goals, even if they were right. Second, bloody consequences. The consequence of Luciano's liberation and the revival of the Dons in Sicily was not only drug traffic. It was the strengthening of the Mafia on both sides of the Atlantic, which led to real blood. Cosa Nostra, which received American approval, for decades after the war turned Sicily into a domain of violence, robbery, and political corruption. The victims were Sicilian politicians, journalists, and judges who tried to stop the new beast, created in part by our hand. This is not just a historical footnote. It explains why the Mafia became so resilient and international. Luciano, using his deportation as an opportunity, connected the Sicilian and American families into a single, ruthless system. What Mori destroyed, we, the Allies, restored and strengthened. This deal is a vivid example of how military necessity can generate a catastrophe for years to come. We used the Mafia to win a short battle, but we lost a long war for a clean reputation, for real democracy in Sicily, and for the safety of our streets in the future. We, the military command, gave Lucky Luciano the seal of the USA. That is why when you watch movies about World War II, when you see pompous parades, remember this shadow side. About the ONI agents who went to Luciano in prison. About Don Calogero Vizzini in an American Jeep. About the fact that for the sake of a great victory, we had to stain our hands with the dirtiest blood imaginable. History does not give us the right to purity. It only teaches that you need to look at the price you pay. And for Operation Underworld, that price was paid by our citizens for decades. We've been sitting here for almost an hour and talking not about victory, but about the price. About how anyone who lives long enough faces a moment when you know there is no clean path. You will have to get dirty to save what you love. Military intelligence saved thousands of our boys' lives by concluding this secret pact with the king of the criminal underworld. They chose tactical victory in the war against Hitler over the purity of their reputation. And for this, they paid with decades of criminal chaos that returned to the streets of our country and flourished in Sicily. We put out the world fire that threatened to burn us all down. But as payment, we gave the key to our dark room, from which emerged a genie who was waiting in a locked cage. We won the campaign, but we gave power to the most terrible people in the world. I'll say it straight. This story hits the heart. It teaches that great victories always have an underground sponsor. And now you. Tell me, if you were there, in 42, in front of the burning liner, would you shake Lucky Luciano's hand? This is not a question of history. It is a question of your conscience and your choice. I want to hear what you think about it. Leave your opinion. And if you need such honest, brutal stories without cuts and gloss, subscribe. We are just starting to talk. See you.